Good morning. I have a few announcements to begin with. If you have sound issues during this webinar, please see the sound issues box just below the chat box. If there is a global sound issue, we will announce it in this chat box. If you are unable to resolve a sound issue, and it seems like sound is moving pretty smoothly this morning, so hopefully that won't be a problem, but if you are experiencing one, be advised that we are recording the meeting and you can watch it online after the meeting ends. Again, if there's a global sound issue, we will make an announcement in the chat box. I'm also just going to mention now that after we stop recording, we will put up a file, the certificate for you to download. So I'll just address those questions ahead of time, that's going to come after we stop recording. We'll ask you to stay on the line and we'll do that. So good morning. Thank you for being with me today to talk about guns in the library. I am here today with Sylvia Watson, who is the General Counsel for the Indiana State Library, and she will be monitoring your questions as they come in. Oh, that's a good idea, yes. Okay, now I will put up our slides. That's a good idea. Doing two things at once. And Sylvia is, of course, welcome to chime in at any time. She has actually more experience in this area than I do in answering these questions. So know that her work is being represented here regardless of whether she's the one talking about it. Also, I am delighted to have Mary Kay Emmerich here from Newton County Public Library, where she has been the library director since 1994.
Forever.
Okay. My name is Cheri Harris, and I am the director of the State Library Certification Program and a legal consultant here. Because I am an attorney, I need to start this with a disclaimer. That is, the purpose of this webinar is to provide general education on the issues, not to provide specific legal advice as to the particulars of your individual situation. As such, we of course encourage you to consult with your attorney, and in particular when we talk about policies in a little bit, know that we believe that your board attorney should review policies before the board adopts them. So anything we suggest is with that proviso that it may or may not address your individual situation. We're going for the general big picture here. And here's a little roadmap to give you an idea of where we're planning to go today. And I am planning to leave time at the end for questions and answers. Although if you think of questions along the way, you can certainly put them in the chat, and Sylvia is going to help us circle back to any questions that may have been asked. Just another sort of qualification about what we're talking about today. My goal is to look at what the law says, not what the law should say, because I recognize that there are a variety of views, not only in the community, but also among you and your staff, and perhaps even on this panel. But those views are really beside the point of this presentation, because our focus today is on what the law says and how to comply with it. So, gosh, it almost does not even need a discussion why we're approaching this topic, but I think it's a good idea to give you a little bit of context because the law hasn't really changed recently in this area. The information that we're going to provide hasn't changed very much, but we have noticed an increase in questions and requests on this topic. And it seems like even though the law hasn't necessarily changed, that the level of anxiety has. And you seemed eager for the opportunity to discuss and revisit this topic. We've gotten comments like, I need more information on this so I can educate, instruct, or reassure my staff, what's expected of public libraries so we comply with the laws and protect everybody, and I plan to get advice from my local police, but they don't know libraries. In January 2017, the American Library Association's Council adopted a resolution that encouraged libraries to collaborate with appropriate local agencies to provide training and education of library workers related to the presence of guns in the workplace. So that pretty much is going to be our focus today. Also, this February, some of you pointed out to us, and I know saw and read an article in Library Journal, the feature article on guns in the library. And that article covered topics like knowing the drill, improving awareness, stricter security, expert tips. Some of the suggestions that were included in that article were assessing the layout of your building for strengths and weaknesses, considering whether opening and closing are particularly vulnerable times, and whether you should consider having some kind of reinforcement during those vulnerable times. In looking for library incidents that came close to home, the closest, most recent thing I found was a year ago this month. There was a shooting in a library at Columbus, Ohio. The headline read, "Argument in Study Area Led to Downtown Library Shooting, Police Say." And the situation here was that two men argued in a second floor study area. Somebody accidentally bumped into the suspect. The victim said, "You pushed my girl, don't you say excuse me?" And the suspect cursed the victim, pulled a gun from his pants, and fired 3 shots. However, the victim was shot in the ankle and limped away from the scene, so nobody was seriously injured in that incident, but scores of patrons ran for the exits when they heard the shots. A girl was knocked down in the commotion. That's something that we may not think of, but that's good to be aware of when you have people fleeing. There may be other injuries unrelated to gunshots. The suspect surrendered when confronted by the library security, and witnesses said that it would have been worse if it had happened on the same floor as the children's section. I bring this up because it seems like a fairly likely scenario. This is not a mass shooting. There's no elaborate plan. The security team made a difference, and the disruption, people said after the fact, was out of proportion to the incident. Oops, oh no, I did not want to do that. Close. Sorry. Here we go. So more recent local events. I'm sure you all heard about the 13-year-old student who opened fire in a classroom in Noblesville at a Noblesville middle school, shot a teacher and another student multiple times in May, late May. The teacher in that case was pretty instrumental in bringing a much quicker resolution to that situation than might have happened otherwise. And then just this week, a customer sat on a sofa at the IKEA in Indianapolis and accidentally dropped a gun without realizing it. He was carrying it in his pants pocket, and it fell out of his pants pocket when he sat down. That gun lodged between the cushions where a child found it and shot it. No one was injured in that incident. And we're gonna refer back to that incident a little bit later on. And then horrible news yesterday, 5 journalists were killed at a newspaper office. So most of you were aware of that already, but that kind of brings into sharp focus why we have to discuss these things. Most of you know about the Second Amendment of the US Constitution, and I'm really not going to discuss that, but I thought you might be interested in seeing the parallel provision from our Indiana Constitution. So I put that up here. And now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what the Indiana Code says. We're not going to cover all gun laws because there are a lot of them, and most of them aren't relevant to your positions working in public libraries. But we are going to talk about the ones that specifically do impact you. So in 2011, there was firearms legislation that passed that made a number of changes. Perhaps one of the largest ones is it took away the right of a political subdivision to regulate firearms. And so the language here is except as provided in Section 4, and we'll go over what those exceptions are in a second. A political subdivision may not regulate firearms, ammunition, and firearms accessories, the ownership, possession, carrying, transportation, registration, transfer, and storage of firearms, ammunition, and firearms accessories. And just to be really clear, that word political subdivision in that statute is defined to include very specifically a public library. So there's no question that this code section applies to public libraries. This chapter applies to public libraries. Now, the exceptions that were outlined in Section 4 at the beginning of that section, there are several exceptions included. Many of them relate specifically to law enforcement or specifically to other places, other activities, but there are 3 of them that are important for you to know about. The first one is that an employer is allowed to prohibit employees from carrying firearms and ammunition in the course of the employee's official duties. So when your staff is at work and on the clock, you can prohibit them from carrying firearms during those times. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. The next one that I think is important for you to know about is that there is a provision that allows you to prohibit or restrict the intentional display of a firearm at a public meeting. And then finally, there is a provision, and just to let you know, the separate resource document that I sent out last night, and it will be posted at the end here, I have listed each of these statutes with a real brief summary and a link to where you can find the full text at the Indiana General Assembly's website. So that's available to you, but I just wanted to hit the highlights here. The last of these 3 exceptions is for an event occurring on property leased from a political subdivision by a promoter or organizer of the event. The promoter or organizer may establish rules of conduct or admission and may condition attendance on those rules. So basically, if, for example, somebody rents a community room at your library and uses it to have a wedding or a birthday party or whatever they might want to have there, they can they can ask attendees at that event, even though it's in your building, to not carry weapons or firearms to that event. So those are the 3 exceptions that I think directly apply to a library setting. And then it is also relevant, I think, to look at how the statute defines firearm. It defines it very broadly: any weapon capable of expelling, designed to expel, or that may readily be converted to expel a projectile by means of an explosion. So just for a variation, one of the questions I had recently asked about, what if somebody brings a pellet gun into the library? Can we regulate that? Now, I am not technically versed in the distinctions between different types of guns and whether they use an explosion to expel the projectiles, or whether or not compressed air, for example, would be considered an explosion. Here's my legal opinion on that, or thought on that, is that this statute is so broad, I would give it wide berth. I would say it's probably not worth getting into litigation about what explosion means and whether it includes compressed air. I think that those details, I mean, given the breadth of the statute, I would treat things that look like firearms as firearms, and leave it at that.
I agree. It's my first thought as a library director is, why would someone bring a pellet gun into the library? But
that doesn't mean they can't.
That doesn't mean they can't, and I would treat it as a weapon, as a firearm.
Right. Okay, so I know that the underlying concern in many of your questions is not just what legally do we have to do, what legally can we not do, but it's really what can we do about safety and wanting to keep people safe. And in keeping with our theme for today, which is that we want you to focus on regulating patron behavior, not regulating guns, which you are not allowed to regulate. So focusing on patron behavior, looking at some of the statutes that allow you to protect the safety of your staff and patrons, want you to be aware that pointing a firearm at another person is against the law. The statute says that a person who knowingly or intentionally points a firearm at another person commits a level 6 felony. It's a class A misdemeanor if the firearm was not loaded.
But keep in mind, when you handle firearms, you always consider them being loaded.
Right, you're not going to know if
Yep.
it's loaded or not, but and the patron may or may not know. The
Exactly.
person carrying the weapon may or may not know.
And if you point a gun at me, it's small potatoes whether it's loaded or not. You pointed a weapon at me.
The next one to keep in mind is battery. The battery statute is long. It's over a page long, but the essence of it, what you need to know about it, is that a person who knowingly or intentionally touches another person in a rude, insolent, or angry manner commits Class B misdemeanor. And then the next one is criminal recklessness. And I mentioned that we would talk about the IKEA incident again. Just a few days ago, the prosecutor filed charges against the man who dropped that weapon in the couch. And what they charged him with was criminal recklessness. So a person who recklessly, knowingly, or intentionally performs an act that creates a substantial risk of bodily injury to another person commits criminal recklessness, and that is a Class B misdemeanor. But if it's done while armed with a deadly weapon, it becomes a level 6 felony. And it becomes a level 5 felony if it's done by shooting a firearm into a building or place where people are likely to gather. So certainly that describes a library, a building or place where people are likely to gather.
And keep in mind, a level 6 felony is the lowest level of felony. So as the number decreases, the severity of the felony increases.
Correct. That's correct. And that's also kind of a new feature, relatively new feature in our criminal justice system, the level 5 and 6, the numbers instead of letters. And then lastly, wanted to mention provocation. A person who recklessly, knowingly, or intentionally engages in conduct likely to provoke a reasonable person to commit battery commits provocation. And that is a Class C infraction. In some ways, that definition is maybe doesn't seem that helpful. Is someone going to provoke someone to commit battery, another person, a reasonable person to commit battery? But on the other hand, back to focusing on patron behavior, you can restrict provocative behavior that is that is akin to provocation in your library policies. So that's part of the reason that one is there. And now we are going to get to the segment of the program where I am going to share specific real-life questions that I have gotten in the past couple months, or some of these questions that that Sylvia has gotten, and what our answers are to them. So the first one is pretty easy. Can we adopt the following policy? The ABC Public Library prohibits the possession of firearms, ammunition, and the possession of other weapons by persons other than law enforcement officers on library property. And the answer to that is no, you can't. This violates the Indiana law, the first Indiana law that we started talking about at the beginning of the segment of talking about statutes, the firearms legislation. This next one is one that has a lot more discussion possibilities, I think. And that is, do we have the right to ask an individual who comes into the library with a gun to show us his or her license? So you know that the law keeps you from prohibiting someone from entering the library with a firearm, but do you have the right to ask them for to show you their license? And our answer to that, our first answer to that is we do not recommend that you be the one to take that upon yourself to do. Instead, we would suggest calling local law enforcement and asking them to come assess the situation. But having said that, we would encourage you to check with your local law enforcement ahead of time before the situation comes up and find out what circumstances they consider to be appropriate for bringing them in a situation like this. And what we know from different libraries is in some areas, the local law enforcement wants to know. They've said to the library director, we want to know anytime someone comes into your library with a firearm. And then in other communities, perhaps in some communities where people carry firearms regularly, it would be really impractical to contact the police every time somebody comes in with a firearm because that's a daily occurrence. So rather than just say, you know, we're not suggesting you call the police every time this happens, but here's some of the things that we are suggesting. Assess the situation, and library response may vary depending on the particular circumstances, both relating to what your community is like and what is normal in your community, and also based on the details of what's happening. The answer would be potentially quite different if the individual in question was a child.
Very, yes.
In a community where people carry frequently, the police may want you to take some other steps before you get law enforcement involved. And for example, you might need to do some assessing yourself. Is the person acting erratically, unsafely, or in a threatening manner? And if that's happening, then those are good reasons to call the police.
Yes. And if you're in a small public library like I am, and you know your patronage, you know your patrons, and you know George is going to walk in and wears a holster. It may not be completely visible, but he always carries a gun. Maybe you've known that person for 30 years and he's always armed. That's someone that you kind of don't even think about checking. But keep in mind too that a lot of people who open carry are very aware of the laws that impact them, and they are ready to be questioned and will become quite defensive if you question them, and that's where law enforcement comes in. Good.
So if a person is minding their own business and using the library like any other patron, then you would not want to use the emergency phone number to report someone like that is being on your premises with a firearm, unless you actually had perceived some kind of threat from that person. And the bottom line with all that is, if you are concerned about the situation, keep in mind that law enforcement will be better trained in assessing whether or not there's a threat. And if you are concerned, it is helpful to have law enforcement nearby in case a situation does begin to escalate. So another real-life question: can a staff member carry a gun on duty? Is it illegal to tell them not to? And we touched on that already. One of the exceptions that is in the firearms legislation allows you to restrict an employee's carrying a firearm while they are on duty and in the building. So yes, it's not illegal to tell them that they cannot carry a firearm on duty. However, you need to be aware that there is a statute that allows employees to keep a weapon in their locked car, provided it is a weapon that is legal for them to have, and it is either in a locked trunk, in a glove compartment in a locked car, or stored out of sight in a locked car. So any policy that you adopt regarding restricting employees from carrying weapons at work, from carrying firearms at work, you just need to be aware that you cannot prohibit them from keeping a weapon in their locked car out of sight. Okay, and then we had an interesting question recently. Somebody said, we heard about a library doing this and we want to know if we can too. And the question was, can a library install gun lockers and require people who come in the library to put their gun in a locker and then retrieve it upon leaving the library? And the answer to that is no, not in Indiana. You cannot do that. So again, our theme is regulate behavior, not guns. We're going to talk a little bit about acceptable conduct policies, regulating patron behavior. And for this discussion, I'm going to be referring to the document that says resources in big letters that I emailed out to everyone who had signed up for the webinar. I emailed that out last night. So you may have it in front of you already. If not, we are going to post a link to it at the end. And on page 2, we start with some sample policy language. And So the first set of examples is of sort of a smorgasbord. You can pick and choose which of these pieces of language appeal to you. You can incorporate some, none, or all of them into your patron policies. That's up to you and your board and your attorney, but these are acceptable. You can start by focusing on the purpose of the library and say that the library is committed to maintaining a safe and healthy environment conducive to the use and enjoyment of the library by its patrons, and in furtherance of the library's purpose, which you would then state. You can require patrons to be using the library while they're in the building, and you can ask people to leave the building if they are not engaged in reading, studying, attending library programs, or using library materials or resources. And then you can also, in your behavior policies, you can require that patrons not interfere with the use of the library by other patrons or interfere with library employees by performing their duties. You can talk about patrons needing to respect the rights of other patrons, not harassing other patrons, annoying or intimidating them, not following them through the building, not staring at them unnecessarily. You know, there are a variety of ways you can approach the issue of behavior, and just we're encouraging you to think in terms of focusing on what the patron does, not just the existence of whether they're carrying a firearm or not, but what is it that they do to bother other people that would be what go to the essence of that behavior to prohibit that behavior. And then really the sort of closest that we suggest to talking around the issue of a specific firearm is at the bottom of page 2 here. Patrons shall not use the library property or other property that has been brought into the library by the patron or another individual in a manner that creates a safety hazard. So those are some examples of those. We also have sample policies on page 3 that address the 2 of the exceptions that I talked about when we talked about you can't regulate except in certain situations. So there's an example of language that you could use to address prohibiting the intentional display of firearms during public meetings. That practically quotes from the statute verbatim, but with the suggestion that you can include that language on the bottom of your meeting notices or your meeting agendas as a reminder to people who attend the meeting. And then to maybe state what you would do in the case that that was violated, how you would handle that. And then similarly, there's a sample employee or personnel policy example regarding that gives you language to prohibit an employee from carrying a firearm while on duty, carrying it on their person while on duty, but acknowledging that they are allowed, if they are legally permitted to possess firearms, that they can store in their car, provided it is locked and out of sight. So that is the sample language that we wanted to make available to you today. And at this point, we're getting ready to switch topics and talk a little bit about being prepared for an active shooter event. But before we switch, I wanted to give you a chance to ask questions about the content that I just covered if something's on your mind right now. So it looks like several people are typing right now, and we'll give you just a few moments to see if some questions start coming in. And in the meantime, I'll just comment on the fact that we have a really good turnout today. So thank you for that. I hope that this is going to provide you with the type of information that you were hoping to get today. Oh, okay. So I have a question. I see a question. Does this have any implications for academic libraries such as public universities? And let me say that schools and universities have some separate statutes that deal with what can happen on schools and universities. I did not bone up on those for this presentation, so I am not going to try and answer that today. But we can follow up with some information about that. If there are other questions that we are not in a position to answer today, we can send out an email with that information. Okay. Question about having a permit to carry guidelines. Guns are not allowed in schools. Does that also extend to the children's department? I would say that the children's department is not what would be defined as a school. Now, there are 1 or 2 libraries, I think, in the state that are combined school and public libraries, and those may be that may be a different situation. If you're actually co-located on school grounds, then I would say the requirements for schools would apply. But just a children's department within a public library, that would be considered I'm just trying to think of the name. The word is escaping me right now, but the political subdivision. The political subdivision is defined to include a public library. So you want to think of yourself as a political subdivision and subject to the laws as we discussed it earlier, that's specific to political subdivisions. Okay.
You guys, after this question, you can move on, and then we can come back to these questions later.
Right. So we're still going to leave some time for questions at the end, and we'll come back to those. But I want to make sure we give plenty of time to the next segment, where we're going to talk about active shooter events, which I just want to point out is really a different kind of animal than the situation of a patron who walks into the library maybe with a gun and a holster because they carry wherever they go. An active shooter situation is more of an active event rather than a passive carrying situation.
Yes.
So I want to welcome Mary Kay with a nice little picture of Mary Kay here. I want to welcome Mary Kay Emmerich and thank her for driving here from Newton County Public Library, where she is the director. She has a bachelor's degree in education and a master of library science from Ball State University. She's been a library director for 24 years and is active in numerous community organizations, including being a bison ranger, the first time I've heard that before.
Actually, the term we're using right now is bison docent.
Oh,
but
docent.
It's a bison information officer, and it's a volunteer position with our Nature Conservancy land holding. But I like bison ranger. I'm kind of rooting for us to change our names.
How cool is that? And she is also has been given an award for being CASA of the Year, Court-Appointed Special Advocate. So lots of different interests and activities, including working on a variety of professional committees and looking at library policy from a variety of angles. The reason I asked her to join us today is because last summer she shared with the listserv that her board had just adopted an active shooter policy that she wanted to share with everyone and encourage them to look at and consider and invite them to use it in any way they might wish to.
And cut and paste.
And so I am going to ask her some questions about that process. We are going to start with, at her suggestion, putting a definition of active shooter up on the screen here. And I'll just invite you to...
There's a difference between an active shooter and a gun-toting patron. Most of the gun-carrying patrons that come into our buildings are not about to become active shooters. And when I say gun-toting, I'm talking handguns. If a patron comes in with a long gun, a rifle, a shotgun, that would be any cause for concern. One, you can't conceal it, and that's not a personal protection weapon. A handgun, a revolver, is more of a personal protection weapon. So when I talk about the distinction between gun-carrying patrons and active shooters, I'm thinking of handguns. But active shooters, keep in mind, aren't always necessarily one of our gun-toting patrons. Active shooters act on a lot of maligned decision making. They determine where they're going to hit by a variety of elements. They plan ahead. They may not be library patrons. They may not know any of us. They may be estranged spouses. They may be relatives that are upset that you inherited Grandma Sylvia's hutch cabinet. There's any number of reasons. But I think we need to define active shooters so we know exactly what we're dealing with. And that's a person who is actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people on library premises. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty shocking. In most cases, active shooters use firearms and display no patterns or methods for selecting their victims. They're going to stop you, and they don't care who you are. In some cases, active shooters use other weapons and or explosive devices to increase the number of victims and to act as impediments to police and emergency responders. Yesterday's shooting in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, was a good example. Other people who were in that building said they heard explosions and thought that explosive devices were being used, and actually the shooter was setting off smoke canisters to create a physical smoke screen to detract people, to block visible lines of sight from police and responders. So there are lots of different elements that can come into play with an active shooter. But first you have to define what it is you're creating your policy for.
Okay, so here's a little map of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to be asking Mary Kay some questions to help to ask her to share with us, starting with what prompted you to develop a new active shooter policy for Newton County last year?
We've talked about it. My assistant director and I had discussed it, and I'm not a fan of an active shooter policy because I don't think you can, and this is my word, policify behaviors in an emergency situation like this. I think it's a very difficult task to do. Then we had an active shooter incident in Columbus, Ohio, and an active shooter incident in Clovis, New Mexico. Columbus was, there were no victims. There were injuries, but there were no victims. In Clovis, New Mexico, 2 library staff got killed. And I knew then that I had to make a statement and give my staff some guidance.
And how did you go about that? What process did you follow? Who did you involve?
Well, like any true librarian, I did an online search. I went to Inspire, first of all, and looked for library active shooter policies, particular to public libraries. I searched online. I collected some, read them, called information from them, and decided that I needed to look at some of the active shooter education we had discussed at the library. And the assistant director and I worked together on this. She's very actively involved in this with me, and actually we took handgun training together. So she's someone whose opinion I value and whose input I valued in this process.
And what did you learn from that process?
I've learned that, how can I say this? You can't make sweeping generalizations about active shooters. They act with different types of weapons. They are using handguns, revolvers, semi-automatic weapons, long guns, assault rifles. The weapon is as different as each active shooter. The process is the same. I want to be able to statistically look at the types of weapons they use, and I can't do that. I also learned that I can't predict this kind of behavior. You think, well, I'll see somebody walk in the door, and if he's a nut job, I'll kind of know. You can't do that. You can't predict that kind of behavior. You have to be prepared for it.
I know that training your staff was part of this process too. Why was that important, and what role did that play?
An active shooter policy focuses on behaviors, and a lot of those behaviors come from the staff. I can't direct behaviors of an active shooter, but I can direct my staff in what best to do. I can't direct them to do specific tasks and to commit specific behaviors. And I always like to keep this in mind. They can't be disciplined for making incorrect choices according to the active shooter policy. For instance, and my best example is, it's recommended not to use anything that creates a lot of noise, like a cell phone or pulling a fire alarm. If an employee during a true active shooter situation pulls a fire alarm, how do I reprimand that employee later? If that person survives, we won. It doesn't matter if he or she pulled the fire alarm. So you have to kind of give over that it's not an enforceable policy. This is more of a directive policy. We're directing employees in what to do. My staff was trained by the District 1 Task Force for Incident Management, and they taught our staff how to respond and what to do in the sense of run. An active shooter incident begins, flee. If you can get out of the building, get out of the building and go out with your hands up. Hide. If you can't get out of the building, find some place to hide. Hide under your desk, hide in a supply closet, lock yourself in a bathroom, go to the staff lounge, push the refrigerator in front of the door so the perpetrator can't get in the room, but find a place to hide. Or fight. And if you're going to fight, and if you've seen or read anything about active shooter training, when you fight with purpose, you stay aggressive, and you use anything you can find as a weapon. Fire extinguishers, for example. Fire extinguishers are heavy. If you whack me with a fire extinguisher, you're going to stop me in my tracks. Shoot the fire extinguisher at the person. But if a perpetrator is pointing a gun at you, don't shoot the fire extinguisher at them, because their first response is going to be to flinch. They could pull a trigger, set off the device, and you could end up getting shot. I call it the 9/11 effect. The horror of the 9/11 situation taught us that anything can be used as a weapon. So look around your environment and think about what you can use as a weapon. Maybe you've got a paperweight on your desk you could lob at somebody's head. I have a very sharp letter opener that can be used as a knife. Those kinds of things are important to know. We viewed the video, Run, Hide, and Fight, and we discussed our options, and we discussed these. We have staff meetings twice a year, and we always touch back on this policy and talk a little bit about preparedness. One of the things I stress with my staff is to know coworkers. Know what the lady who shares the desk with you, or shares the office with you and has a desk there, has in her purse. If she's on the floor helping patrons and an active shooter situation evolves, and you're in the office, it might help you to know that she has pepper spray in her purse. It might help you to know that she carries a knife. It might help you to know what's in her purse. So know your coworkers and know the kinds of things that they have available to them.
So I just want to point out that on your resource document, we have listed some of the active shooter resources that Mary Kay found and used when she was doing background on putting together her policy. And the first one on that list is the Run, Hide, Fight video. And then on the next page, I have listed a training webinar that the Indiana State Library did that's on our archive page, and a link to that. I listened to that recently, and there was I thought some good and interesting information and suggestions in that. Also, there's a link there to the training that's provided by the Indiana State Police, and there's a way to request live trainings by the state police to come to you using their website there. They also have videos and an information guide on their website, and so there's a link to that. And then I also want to mention that the policy that Mary Kay's board, that the Newton County Library, Public Library Board came up with, is the last 3 pages of this resource guide. We've reproduced it. And I did see a mention that about it being concerned about describing this as a policy rather than an action. And I would just say that that's, as Mary Kay described at the beginning of this segment, that these aren't policies in the sense that she would discipline staff for not following them to the letter, but it creates guidance for people about what to expect, what to consider, an opportunity to think through the possibilities. And Mary Kay, when we talked earlier, you made a comment that you kind of think that an active shooter policy is worthless in some respects in terms of regulating the actions that the staff take during the incident, but that on the other hand, one of the most valuable things you found from doing this was having the policy dictate what happens after the incident. Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
An active shooter incident is going to last 5 or 10 minutes at most. The active shooter incidences aren't all-day events. They are quick, swift, and horrifying. If you survive an active shooter incident, you have to figure out a lot of different elements that are going to suddenly take place. I truly believe the policy is pointless. We talked about this long before we ever wrote it, and I kept saying we're not going to draft a policy for that because it's not something I think you can put into a policy. But what this policy also covers, one, it educates staff and it brings this horrific type of event out into the open so we can sit down and talk about it and talk about what we're going to do and how we're going to respond. And it's ugly and it's uncomfortable, but we're going to talk about it. After the incident, what happens? The police have come, the active shooter has been either killed or removed from the building. Then what happens? How do you assess that situation? And with the law enforcement response, and this is part of the policy that you have in your packet, when the police arrive on the location, how do we behave? We try to remain calm. Put down any items in your hands. Raise your hands and spread your fingers. Keep your hands visible. In yesterday's active shooter situation in Maryland, an observer commented that there were people leaving that building with their hands up and she didn't know why. And I thought, well, you've never had active shooter training. Because if you're running out and there are police officers there, you're going to put your hands up because you're a good guy. You're going to show you're unarmed. The other thing to keep in mind is the police aren't there to protect you during an active shooter situation. They're there to stop the active shooter situation. They don't know if you're a good guy or a bad guy. They may be your friend and neighbor, but you could have gone off the beam. Get your hands up. Avoid making quick movements. Don't ask officers for help or direction while evacuating the building. And the police have that situation to manage. Once the situation is stopped, once the active shooter is stopped, then the police investigation begins. And your library isn't a library any longer. It's a crime scene. You may not be open for a few days. You need to not be moving stuff. You need to not be touching stuff. Leave it the heck alone. The police are going to secure the premises. They're going to arrange designated administrators to help handle things. For instance, the director, the assistant director, the branch manager have access to personnel records so that they can provide medical and contact information for the employees, and they can provide contact information for patrons that are in the building. The library needs to designate someone who will engage with emergency responders and relay that medical information. If an employee who was injured during an active shooter event is diabetic, someone needs to tell those emergency responders that that person has that particular medical issue. Law enforcement officers are trained to notify relatives of injured and killed situations like this. I don't know how to say that quite the right way. If an employee is injured or killed, heaven forbid, let the law enforcement officers contact the family. We aren't trained to do that. That isn't part of library school. We aren't trained to handle horrific information like that. Let those who are handle it. And they can do so in a detached, professional manner that we may not be able to do at that point in time. Most of us just went through a horrible situation. There are OSHA regulations. That sounds so completely odd that there are OSHA guides to how to handle reporting an active shooter incident. But you have an amount of time that you have to report a work-related injury or illness on an OSHA 300 log. So you have that information that you have to take care of, and who's going to handle that? And I want to comment about the media. The media is going to be there. After an active shooter situation, even during, the media is going to be there, and staff, administration, no one from the library should be talking to the media. Let the police do that. And it's okay to tell a reporter shoving a microphone in your face, no, I don't want to talk. No, thank you. I don't have anything to say. No comment. Tell them no, it's okay. They're not your best friend or neighbor. Let the people who are trained to handle the media handle the media. So I think the aftermath of an active shooter situation is more important because the aftermath dictates how we come to terms with the situation and how we continue our lives.
Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about a little bit, and I guess I want to say we're not necessarily suggesting that you need to adopt a policy like this. What we are suggesting is that these are issues you probably want to have an opportunity to study a little bit, consider, and be prepared to address in one way or another. And then, Mary Kay, I know that after you went through this process, you had some follow-up actions that became evident that you should do on the other side of having done this.
Yes, we have staff trainings. One of the things that I've done is taken a floor plan for each building and marked the exits of that on each floor plan and forwarded those to our local police department and our local emergency management administration. That way they know the layout of the building. So if an active shooter incident occurs at one of my locations that I supervise, the sheriff's department knows how the building's laid out. They know where the exits are. They know where they had to have coverage. They know where people may be exiting the buildings. And that's essential for them. We talk about it at work. We talk about what could happen. Those kinds of things don't make it any less horrific. They make us more prepared, because the whole idea behind this is that we've thought it through. We have responses ready to present should an active shooter incident occur. How are we going to escape the buildings? Where are the exits? And being mindful of exits. This also brought up a need in our community that our patrons expressed that they would like to have active shooter training, how to behave in a public building should an active shooter incident present itself. So this fall we're presenting active shooter training for the public. This is for adults. They have to sign up for it, and it's presented through our District 1 task force, or by our District 1 task force. And we're going to talk about how to exit buildings, how to behave, what to do should they be in a situation where an active shooter takes over.
Clearly, just bringing up this subject is really almost more provocative of generating questions than it is answering questions. But you have to start somewhere. So it made sense that this seemed like a logical starting point to us. We are almost out of time here.
I'm trying to answer some of the questions.
Okay, Sylvia. Sylvia has been answering some questions in the chat dialogue as we go. Any questions that we don't get to, as I said before, we will try to come up with answers and provide those to you after later on. Here's a slide with the state library and the state police resources that I mentioned, and just know that there are additional resources to those on that resource document that we've provided. And I think, Sylvia, are there any particular questions that you want to highlight or try and answer now?
I've been answering some of them, but I'm not sure. Some of them need further research, like pepper spray. Someone asked, can you carry pepper spray in the library while on duty?
Yes.
I'm going to switch places.
I'm not aware of that, but Mary apparently needs to answer that one.
I'm going to actually let Sylvia sit in so she can go through
know the answer
some
to
questions and maybe answer ones that do seem.
So somebody asked, can you carry pepper spray in the library while on duty? I haven't researched that personally. Mary Kay says yes.
I'm assuming that you can, because many of us do, myself included. I carry pepper spray in my purse as a normal item. Whether it's legal or not, that I don't know. But we do, several of us on staff do carry pepper spray.
I saw that some people were asking about age limits for who can legally possess a firearm, and I saw that those were answered. We'll have Cheri verify, and if different information needs to go out, we'll take care of that. Can teens bring pellet guns in the library? Again, I didn't personally research the age limit on any of.
I did not either.
It's been a long time since I didn't actually prepare to do the webinar, so I haven't looked at this stuff in a while. But we can find that out and get it back to you. The retired law enforcement officer who quoted the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act. I haven't researched that act personally, so Cheri will take a look at that and see if that changes the analysis on whether or not you can carry concealed on duty.
There is an exception for retired law enforcement officers. If you have 20 years of service, I think is what the statute says, but I looked at that when I was preparing for this, but I don't have it in front of me or in my head, so I can find that statute and share the specific language of that exception.
Somebody mentioned that non-powder guns were not regulated. I think you're referring to the airsoft guns, perhaps? Is that what they're called, airsoft guns? So we'll take a look at that link, so thank you for providing that, and if further information needs to be shared on that, we will. I think I answered most of the other questions, but we'll run through and make sure we got everything.
Also, I did see that there was a comment about why should we tell our employees whether or not they can carry firearms at work. You don't have to prevent them from doing it. It's just that we wanted to let you know that the law allows you to prevent them from carrying weapons at work. If you wish to take advantage of that exception to the law, that is one of the few areas where you can regulate the carrying of a firearm in your building. You can't with the general public, but you can with your staff. And you need to know that if you choose to do that, that your staff still have the right to keep a weapon locked in their car in an appropriate fashion if they're appropriately licensed. So that's why we brought all that up. So hopefully we have clarified a few things here. Mary Kay, someone has asked who will be leading the training for the public on active shooter responses. You said that was District 1. Is that state police?
That is our District 1 emergency response team, and that's the Northwest District of Indiana. They are tied to the Emergency Response Administration. And we can have local law enforcement come in as well. And we're going to be discussing how our buildings are laid out and knowing building layout. So staff are helping as well.
Okay, so here's our contact information. We will do our best to answer questions that you've raised. If you want to contact us about this or other things, we may or may not be able to answer additional questions, but we can usually find a resource that will help address, if not us, somebody who can. Let's see. We are at time now. The formal content for the webinar is now over. We're going to stop recording. but I would like you to stay on for another moment so that we can